Well, we're on the air and it's Thursday, and I hope it's a great one for you. Weatherman says it'll be the last really warm day we have for a while. The cold weather's coming in. I guess that's the way it goes. Anyway, it's a good day, good Thursday. Come on in to my little world for a minute or two and let's share a thought or two. I was thinking about a guy by the name of John. I'd give his whole name, but he might still be around, might still be alive, and it might embarrass him if somehow word got to him. He would probably be, he'd probably be 90 years old by now, pretty close to it, at least well into his 80s, and so he might not be with us anymore. I really just don't know. Came to know John when I was still a student in college and working with a congregation many years ago. Well, more than 40 years ago, nearly 45 years, about 45 years ago, nearly. Anyway, didn't know much about John, really didn't know him at all. Went to work with the congregation and wasn't very long before some events began to take place. We were some get-togethers, especially for the men, and I began to realize how important John was. If you met John, probably wouldn't have been impressed by him, wouldn't have thought much about him. He was one of those guys that worked wearing the kind of grayish work clothes with the heavy shoes and so forth. I never knew exactly what he did. He didn't really like to talk that much about it, didn't really talk about himself all that much. But if we had an event where the men were getting together, you'd always find John there ahead of time, well ahead of time, maybe even taking off work so that he could work and cook the food. Maybe a big pot of beans that he would cook all day long, or some meat that he would be preparing, some fish he would be frying for us, as maybe he'd been out and caught a bunch of fish and decided to have a fish fry. Just the kind of guy he was. Just quietly back there, planning, go in. He'd talk to the preacher in the congregation. He'd say, I'll be there, be all right if I'm in, and he'd work over the stove or whatever, getting things prepared. If you were very careful, you could go in and you could catch him and you'd find him there. And you could talk to him. He'd just say, I'm just doing so-and-so, I'm doing this, taking care of that, cooking the beans or frying the fish, getting things ready, just something that needed to be done. But what I want to tell you about John is he didn't really want any notice. I didn't think all that much about it, really. I was glad he would go and cook the things. I wasn't accustomed to doing those kind of things, but he was, and he just didn't really want any notice about it. It wasn't much later that I heard some things about John, and we had some kids that couldn't afford the fee to go to camp. Talking to the other preacher in the congregation, and I talked to him. I said, we've got a few of the kids that can't afford the fees to go to camp this year. He said, it's all right. It'll be taken care of. And I said, oh, really? I said, is the church going to take care of it? Well, he said, not exactly. But he said, every year there's a fellow who comes and asks me if any of the kids need help going to camp. And when he finds out how many there are, he just reaches into his pocket, starts pulling out the money and hands me the money and says, take care of it. I said, do you mind if I ask who it is? He said, well, he'd rather people not know who he is. But ultimately, he told me it was John. And that was only one of the occasions when something would come up and we needed some money for one of the children's homes or some benevolence case came along. He would ask, and he would always fork out a little money, or he would run and take care of the business. He would purchase things and bring them down there. He didn't really want to go and deliver the goods to people because he just really didn't want to be seen. There probably weren't that many of us that knew how much John did. But if something needed doing, something needed a little money, he would jump in and do it. Now, you might think John was a guy that had a lot. But I had noticed he drove an old car that was getting pretty old, ragged. Not because it was a classic, but because it still ran and he really just didn't need to buy another one, so he would use his money for other things. And I caught him one day pulling out of the parking lot with the old car, and I looked at it and I thought, man, this car has seen better days, but Sure seems to run good. And I stopped him and I talked a few minutes. Always congenial, always friendly, always encouraging, but always behind the scenes. You know, if John's still alive, as I said, he'd be an old man. But I think he's got a list of many good things that he did over the years, but he probably doesn't have it written down anywhere. And honestly, very few people know that he was the one who did it. I've thought about that. Now, there's nothing wrong with people noticing that you've done a good deed. Jesus said, let your light so shine that men might see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven. Nothing wrong with your works being seen and recognized and God getting the glory for them. But I've always appreciated those people who wanted to do something good, but just never really wanted to notice. Jesus said a little bit later, in the same context, but when you do a charitable deed, Matthew 6, verse 3, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. You do it in secret, he said. Your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. Very next verse. It's all about the motivation for doing it. In my mind, maybe John was a somewhat shy person, but I think he had the right motivation. He didn't want the public acclaim because that just wasn't the kind of guy he was, but he also didn't need it because he knew why he was doing it. When you know why you're doing what you're doing, all pats on the back and acclaim are nice, but when you know why you're doing it, it's probably good enough. When you see that you've done something good. Maybe it's a bowl of beans for a hungry guy who comes to a men's dinner. Maybe it's a child that gets to go to camp for a week during the summer. Maybe it's some benevolence case who has some fresh food in the pantry. Could be any number of things. We're thankful for a guy like John, who's always ready to jump in there and do it. He's not alone. I know some of you are just like that. And you know what? I think before the day's over, thank the Lord. Thank the Lord for people like that, and even for yourself that you have the opportunity to do it. It's a good thing. You know, Peter said of Jesus in Acts chapter 10, as he talked to the household of Cornelius, spoke of the man Jesus, he said, who went about doing good. What a great opportunity. Just go about doing good. Don't make a big splash about it. Don't expect to acclaim. If it comes, that's fine. But just go about doing good. I think John set a pretty good example as well. I hope in a lot of ways I can be a little bit more like John. How about you? Hey, it's a great Thursday. Let's enjoy it. Let's go about doing some good, and we'll talk some more a little further down the road.